the end of post-war consensus society in the 1970s.
I'm A.
And I'm M. Feminism and women's rights. The 1970s saw the high point of second-wave feminism. Following the initial women's liberation meeting in 1970, women's lib organisations popped up all across the country and demonstrations. They disrupted a Miss World contest in November 1970. London and Liverpool saw demonstrations in 1971 demanding equal pay and free 24-hour nurseries. This movement that had support across the world can be seen in the inauguration of International Women's Day by the United Nations in 1977. Women's lib organisations disrupted the 1970 Miss World contest held in November because they felt it objectified women. The host, Bob Hope, was heckled and protesters threw stink and smoke bombs onto the stage. Task: watch this video on the interruption to the Miss World contest.
However, feminism was also split between ideologies. Radical feminists, sometimes also separatist, believed women were oppressed by patriarchal society and campaigned particularly on issues such as reproductive rights. Socialist feminists identified a clearer class dimension to women's equality and campaigned on issues that would enable women to achieve financial independence. Progress was made in advancing reproductive rights. Although the birth control pill had been available in the 1960s, its use became much more widespread once it was available through the NHS in 1971. Attempts were also made to tackle violence against women.
1. The Domestic Violence Act, 1976. The Domestic Violence Act made it possible for women to take out court orders restraining violent partners. The first rape crisis centre opened in London in 1976.
Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, murdered 3 women, attempted to murder 7 more between 1975 to 1980, and this led to Reclaim the Night marches.
2. The Sex Discrimination Act 1975 aimed to end discrimination against men or women on the basis of their gender or marital status. It aimed to ensure quality of opportunity in employment and education. It aimed to outlaw harassment. The Act also set up the Equality Opportunities Commission. The Equality Opportunities Commission was set up to oversee the SDA and Equal Pay Act. It could bring court proceedings against any party it judged to not be agreeing to these acts. It only launched 9 investigations in 8 years between 1976 and 1983, and only 10% of sex discrimination claims in the workplace were successful, and it was extremely difficult to prove. Task: how does this change differ from women's lives in the 50s and 60s? Make a comparison table.
Equal Pay Act 1970 came into force in 1975. From 1971, women were able to take out a mortgage without a male guarantor. This was evidence of women's economic position improving. In the same year, Barbara Castle steered through reforms to the state earnings-related pension scheme with the Social Security Pensions Act. These were made by Barbara Castle. This became more generous to women whose contributions had been limited by caring responsibilities. The Employment Protection Act of 1975 introduced paid maternity leave and outlawed dismissal on the grounds of pregnancy.
Trade unions. Trade unions continued inequalities as they were dominated by men, and suspicions remained against women in the workplace. But 1979, the TUC published a charter, Equality for Women within Trade Unions. This was good, as the Equal Pay Act did not solve all the concerns that women were not treated equally. Employers could get around by making tasks slightly different and not comparable. Women's wages went from 59% of men's in 1970 to 70% in 1977.
Race and immigration. The Conservatives introduced the Immigration Act in 1971. This restricted the rights of people from the new Commonwealth from coming to Britain, as they had to have a guaranteed job and had at least one grandparent born in Britain. There remained a steady flow of immigrants from India subcontinent, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and events abroad often caused sudden influxes. Reasons for immigration: Ugandan Asians fleeing persecution in the early 1970s, Bangladeshis fleeing Bangladesh after its breakaway from Pakistan in 1974. However, these were made an exception from the Act. Many of those affected had British passports, having moved from India to Uganda when India was still a British colony. 28,000 arrived in Britain.
By 1974, over 1 million new Commonwealth immigrants had come to Britain. Key facts: the Asian population of Bradford was 50,000, East African Asians in Leicester was 20,000, and by 1974 there were 325,000 West Indies, 435,000 India and Pakistan, 150,000 African. Political representation in immigrant communities was very limited. In 1974 London Borough Council elections, only 10 non-white councillors were elected. In 1978, 35 non-representative of size of community. These immigrants tended to settle in the same areas where there were already cultural and familial networks.
Despite strict immigration rules, race relations continued to be an issue. In 1976, Labour passed their Race Relations Act as an attempt to try and tackle discrimination based on race. Commission for Racial Equality had the power to investigate claims and compel witnesses to appear. Task: who was Enoch Powell?
Became very active in parts of London where immigrants had settled, such as Brick Lane in Southall. Although it never won any elections, its popularity grew in the 1970s. The National Front was a political party founded by John Tyndall in 1967. It opposed to non-white immigration. It held marches and demonstrations in areas of high levels of immigration. It was provocative and marked by violence. Their membership grew, 20,000 members by 1976. They put up 90 candidates in the 1974 election, but won no seats. They had major parties felt they had to comment on immigration due to evidence of concern. Conservative Party toughened up immigration policy even further in order to limit immigration. They were worried over loss of support if they didn't say anything. Some said Thatcher was appealing to racists. She received thousands of letters of support. Conservatives had an 11-point lead in the polls. Violence. Trade Council of East London gave details of over 100 incidents. 2 murders between January 1976 and August 1978.
Impact of the National Front. The Anti-Nazi League was set up in 1977 to combat violence. Racists. Some skinheads were attracted to the National Front and were behind many of the attacks. They were often behind violent attacks on people from other ethnic backgrounds, what was sometimes called Paki rashing. Anti-racists. Rock Against Racism, 1976. Concert in Trafalgar Square, 1978. These were made as a reaction to comments made by the rock guitarist Eric Clapton in support of Enoch Powell.
10. Immigration and the police. There was a high distrust regarding the police treatment of ethnic minorities. In 1976, only 70 police officers were black or ethnic minority out of 22,000 in the Metropolitan Police. Young black people felt they were harassed unnecessarily. Notting Hill Carnival, 1976, and the death of Blair Peach in 1979. Suspicions regarding police attitudes were highlighted by events such as the death of Blair Peach in 1979. Blair Peach was a teacher and anti-Nazi League supporter who was killed when a demonstration was blocked by police. It was alleged that he was struck on the head by a police truncheon. The Metropolitan Police finally admitted responsibility for his death in 2010. Tensions were often apparent at events like the Notting Hill Carnival. In 1976, this hostility erupted into a riot where over 300 people were injured, and following this, there were calls to ban the event.
Popular culture. Progress. Black footballers Justin Fashanu and John Barnes. In 1978, Viv Anderson was the first black player for England. Reggae and ska music became increasingly popular, and local authorities began to follow multicultural policies. Racism. Football terraces were also scenes of overt racism. Comedians were still able to make racist jokes, and the minstrel show was made until 1978. In 1980, the Commission for Racial Equality was warning, racial prejudice is still rife, and so is racial discrimination, while the response of the government has been disappointingly inadequate.
Youth culture. Youth culture in the 1970s continued to cause concerns for older generations. In many ways, youth subculture reflected the social, political, and economic battles going on elsewhere.
The start of the punk movement. Punks were influenced by bands in the US, for example the New York Dolls, who rejected commercialism. They were also inspired by British bands like the Sex Pistols, The Clash, The Damned, and the Buzzcocks. They were characterised by loud guitar music with words shouted over. The lyrics reflected social alienation that many young people felt. The punk philosophy was nihilistic, and it had a major rejection of hippie culture and an embrace of DIY. Being able to play musical instruments was less important than the attitude. The typical punk image was shocking. Bondage gear, safety pins, ripped t-shirts, and spikes in hair were often used. Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren Shop's sex was extremely influential on the punk image.
Punks and moral panic. At punk concerts, performers and the audience spat on each other, and often there were violent scuffles. The Sex Pistols swore on live TV, newspaper headlines, The Filth and the Fury. The Sex Pistols' controversial single, God Save the Queen, released during the Queen's Silver Jubilee year in 1977. The BBC refused to play it, but it still reached number 2. Task, who was the moral campaigner of the 1960s?
Development of skinhead culture. This had developed from mods in the late 1960s, and they were often working class. They were initially influenced by Jamaican music and culture, and many skinheads were actually apolitical, but by the 1970s they were becoming increasingly linked to the National Front and football hooliganism. Football hooliganism was already a growing problem at the beginning of the 1970s, but it gradually worsened over the decade. The English disease was scenes of violence becoming so common that football hooliganism became known as the English disease. This was organised hooligan groups being linked to particular football clubs such as the Chelsea Headhunters.
Environmentalism. Political philosophy concerning human impact on nature brought to life due to scientific progress. 1. European conservation. It was decided in 1970 that it would be a year of European conservation. This led to campaigns and pressure groups and protest. For example, Friends of the Earth USA expanded to include Britain and Sweden in 1971.
The CND was originally protesting against nuclear weaponry, but now it included how nuclear power was used for electricity and its waste. This was spurred on by, in 1957 to 1979, there had been 5 incidents at Sellafield and a partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island, New York, 1979. Task: write down everything you know about the CND. Think Labour divisions.
3. Greenpeace. Founded in 1971, a radical organisation that originally campaigned against whaling. Greenpeace UK formed in 1977.
Animal Liberation Front. It was formed in 1976 after a discovery in 1975 that beagles in laboratories were forced to smoke 30 cigarettes a day. They carried out violent acts on pharma companies. From 1973, they letter-bombed politicians, including Margaret Thatcher in 1984.
5. TV programmes. Many were made by the BBC. For example, a National History Unit in Bristol raised a lot of awareness. In 1979, David Attenborough's Live on Earth in colour TV gained audiences worldwide. Task: watch this video.
Gaia theory, proposed by British thinker James Lovelock, gained many adherents for his Gaia theory. It was the interconnectedness of all ecological issues.
Popular culture. Watership Down was published in 1972 and became a bestseller. A situation comedy, The Good Wife, in 1975. Teddy Goldsmith's A Blueprint for Survival in 1972 advocated a return to self-sufficiency and a de-industrialised society.
The People's Party put up 5 candidates in 1974, including Goldsmith. It changed its name to the Ecological Party in 1975 and put up 53 candidates in the 1979 election. Environmentalism proved it had a permanent place in politics. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.